Well, I had the wonderful privilege today of getting to talk to Dr. Mark Strauss out of Bethel Seminary. Dr. Strauss is a New Testament professor at Bethel, as well as serving as the vice chair on the Committee of Bible Translation for the New International Version and an associate editor for the New International Version Study Bible. Dr. Strauss has a new book out as a part of InterVarsity Press's 40 Question series, which is an amazing series if you haven't checked it out up to this point. His part in that series is 40 questions about Bible translation. I just read this last week, an amazing book and an important resource, I think, for every Christian, especially Christians with questions about Bible translation or Bible translations. Naturally, that book, or rather the subject of that book, was the focus of our conversation today. I tried to pack in as many of the most pressing questions I have and that I run into regularly with regard to Bible translation, and hopefully they are some of the questions you also ask or get asked from time to time. So I hope you enjoy the conversation and benefit from all the wisdom Dr. Strauss shares. And of course, I would encourage you to pick up this book that you might have even greater confidence in the Bible after reading it, and so that you can have answers to these common questions when you get asked. So without further ado, here's my conversation with Dr. Strauss. My name is Ryley, and you are listening to the Ryley Heppner podcast. So apart from being a New Testament professor, as far as I understand, you are vice chair of the Committee of Bible Translation for the NIV and then associate editor for the NIV Study Bible. Is that still accurate?
Yes, that's still accurate. Yeah.
Okay. So I'd be curious just to know what was the journey like that led you into biblical scholarship and then eventually into Bible translation? Like, how did you end up there? Did you always have a passion for Bible translation?
Yeah, that's a great question. In terms of biblical scholarship, I was not really expecting to pursue biblical scholarship. In college, I was a psychology major, got a little disenamored. Oh, excuse me. Got a little disenamored with that and decided to take some courses in seminary.
Okay.
And really never left. Enjoyed it so much, a great deal, and stayed on and eventually moved into the academic side of that. That's a long story,
Okay.
but I've always been fascinated by language and interested in language, and taught Greek as part of my New Testament role, and always taught a bit about linguistics, how language functions when I'm teaching Greek. And I remember in one class, I was teaching an elective on Philippians, and I always tell my students that words don't have a single literal meaning. They have a range of potential meanings. One of my students raised the question, if that's the case, they said, then why does the NIV translate the Greek word adelphoi as brothers instead of brothers and sisters? And I said, doesn't brothers sound inclusive to you? And everyone in the class said no, maybe showing my age a little bit. And I thought that's interesting, and thought about it a while, and then wrote an article about gender and language and how we need to pursue the true meaning of the word in context, which in that case is brothers and sisters, rather than brothers, and think in some sense that's a literal translation, because it's not a literal translation. The translation that's what the word means in context.
Sure.
And began to write about the gender issue in translation. Wrote a little rather naive article about that. About that time, as luck would have it, there was a huge controversy for gender language in Bible translation.
Mm-hmm.
I was kind of poised. I had been writing in that area for a while and was poised to respond to that. Came out with what many viewed as sort of the liberal perspective on that, which it wasn't at all. It's just based on sound translation principles, arguing that the Greek word anthropos generally means human being, not man, in terms of a male person, and arguing that that's just good translation policy. The NIV committee was introducing that language, as virtually all translations were, because English has changed so dramatically over the years. And so eventually asked me to join the committee, really based on that work in many ways, that I had been, from a linguistic perspective, not really from the perspective of the debate over the role of men and women in the church, but from a linguistic perspective, was arguing that what they were doing was exactly just good translation principles, that translating words according to their meaning and context. there's a whole backstory as to the attacks on the NIV and other versions, but I
Yeah.
won't get into that unless you want to pursue
Well, actually,
anything.
that's a really interesting, I don't know, gateway into to being on these committees and stuff and working on the NIV. And actually, down the list, I did have a question, so maybe I'll ask it now. I was just, and you can be brief because again, I mean, or as brief as you want. I know you exhaust a lot of these things in the book, so I don't want to take away from people going to the book for bigger answers. But how does one respond to the critics of the NIV who write it off saying the NIV has gone gender neutral,
Yeah.
and that meaning a certain level of wokeness or liberality or what would be the fuller picture from a translator of the
Yeah.
NIV of
Yeah.
gender in Bible translation?
Yeah, and the NIV and other versions like it are not gender neutral, they're gender accurate.
Okay.
The goal is to reproduce the meaning of the text. So if the word in context means a man, then you should say man. If the word in context means a person, then you should say person. So you're just translating according to the meaning and context, which is what every translation should do.
Mm-hmm.
And what is interesting is 25 years ago, we were arguing that we were gender accurate, and we're getting incredible flack from various circles. If you look at those very circles, they have come around now, and they're doing exactly what we were doing. The couple of examples: the English Standard Version is a revision of the Revised Standard Version, the RSV, and they changed the word man to person or something similar over 500 times in the ESV.
Okay.
And so they're already moving in that direction, but then they push back on some of those examples. The Holman Christian Standard Bible, I think it was first published in 2001. It was really kind of defiantly anti-gender inclusive, gender neutral, as they would call it. Well, the CSB, the revision of the Holman Christian, the 2017 revision, went brothers and sisters all the way through.
Okay.
And so they have dramatically changed. And so those who were most criticizing us have now come around and recognized that this is just good translation policy.
Yeah. Oh, interesting. So I was going to ask, like the circles that you were saying that criticize, those circles are other Bible translation committees, kind of other
Uh,
translators.
yeah, and yeah, that's right. And some of them still would say they haven't moved an inch. If you
Okay.
look at, even though if you look at what they said, they'll say, oh no, we follow the Colorado Springs, what are called the Colorado Springs guidelines.
Okay.
But in fact, they don't. I mean, if you look at the examples of what those guidelines actually said, um, at the time, they were attacking what they're now doing.
Okay.
Um,
Could you give a word on that on the Colorado Springs uh,
yeah.
guidelines?
What happened was World Magazine, this would be 1997, I believe, maybe 96, 97. World Magazine published an article. They got wind that the British were producing a gender inclusive NIV. The British public was really, Christian public, really, the NIV really sounded so wrongly masculine to them.
Okay.
That, saying man, man, men, God wants all men to come to him, these kinds of statements where in fact, it just sounded wrong.
Okay.
And so they were really pushing and saying, you need to update this translation. It sounds horrible. It doesn't sound like good English. And so the Biblica, which was back then called the International Bible Society, produced a British version of the NIV that introduced this kind of inclusive language. Only when it reflected the meaning
Sure.
the author intended. If it meant brothers and sisters, you should say brothers and sisters, or siblings, if you will. If it meant person, you should say person. And so they did. They produced that version. Well, World Magazine got wind of this and published this expose article calling it the Stealth Bible, that Zondervan and the International Bible Society were quietly going gender neutral. And really, the article is primarily about egalitarianism and feminism in the church, the rise of feminism in the church and attacking that. But it used this as sort of the whipping boy, that this is the example of that. And to be honest, all hell broke loose in terms of that. I mean, that it was like they're neutering our Bible. This is political correctness gone amok.
Yeah.
It was a huge thing. And suddenly Zondervan, who has the publishing rights, commercial publishing rights to much of the NIV, and the International Bible Society that owns the copyright to the NIV, they began to back off. And there was a group that got together James Dobson actually arranged it at the
Okay.
Focus on the Family headquarters, and a group got together and they put together a series of guidelines that came to be known. They weren't originally called this, but they came to
Yeah.
known as the Colorado Springs Guidelines. Well, I entered the field really by writing a response to that that was given as a paper at the Evangelical Theological Society.
Yeah.
And that got published eventually in the Journal of the Evangelical Theological Society, together with a rejoinder by Wayne Grudem responding against it. That really was what launched my career in many
Okay.
ways. Because, that was, you're suddenly in the fray. I was in a Christianity Today debate. The magazine was, the cover story was devoted to a debate between pro and con, with this gender language.
Yeah.
And so that was how it all started. The Stealth Bible, the cover of the World magazine has a picture of a stealth fighter on it saying,
Okay.
the Stealth Bible that is quietly going gender neutral. And
Oh,
again,
that's funny.
people who read it from a distance, the problem is Christians aren't terribly good critical thinkers
Yeah, sure.
often, and they react and respond rather than investigate.
Yeah.
And in fact, sadly, 100 Christian influencers, biblical scholars, this is before the internet really, they called them that, but biblical scholars, some biblical scholars, many pastors signed a petition calling for the stopping of this.
Okay.
Well, most of those have since recognized and wish they never signed that
Okay.
statement, because they recognize this is just good translation policy, and now everybody is doing it as
Yeah.
well.
Oh, that's interesting. Can I ask you this? I would imagine it's probably based on just knee-jerk reaction, but are the opposing forces to the gender neutral kind of spot, are they often in the complementarian camp? Like, do those often correlate, even though they probably shouldn't?
Great question. Yes, and in fact, it was those who were in the complementary camp who responded in support that was so influential.
Okay.
Don Carson, D.A. Carson, I don't know if you know.
Yep, absolutely.
From Trinity. Carson wrote a book almost the same time I wrote a book, in fact,
Okay.
that's saying almost the same thing exactly, defending the gender inclusive use of language.
Okay.
In fact, he cited my article that I gave, that paper I gave in that book quite a lot. But yeah, so he came out, and that enormously helped me, obviously, to have a heavyweight like Carson come out saying essentially the same thing. It killed my sales because he took, who's going to buy a Strauss book in contrast to a Carson book? but no, I'm just teasing there.
Yeah.
But I was very encouraged by that.
Okay.
Daryl Bach from
Okay.
Dallas Seminary came out strongly in support. Craig Blomberg from Denver, and I would say something like all the scholars I most respect, I was pleased, came out basically in support of what I was saying, what those on my side, if you will, the argument were saying. So even though we were getting hammered by the popular Christian press, all those who counted in my mind were really supportive, which kind of confirmed my sense that this was the right way to go, that this was actually, just good Bible translation, good sound linguistics, good hermeneutics.
Basically. And would Blomberg and Bach both identify as complementarian?
Oh yes, I'm sorry, I should have gone back there. Yeah,
Carson obviously.
Carson would, and both. Blomberg, Craig would be like me, a very soft complementarian. I think you might call it. And Daryl maybe as well, a thinking complementarian certainly, but they would all claim to be complementarians. Absolutely.
Okay. Yeah. And that probably was very supportive to you, and I don't know, very something to follow for the general populace, seeing the men that they respect and them being like, no, Strauss is right here.
Yeah, exactly. And I don't know if they were saying Strauss is right, but they were certainly saying that the gender inclusive language is just sound translation policy. Yeah.
Okay. Well, this is probably getting way back to the beginning, but I just wonder if maybe there are some misnomers about it. Could you give a simple definition of what Bible translation is? I just wonder if maybe there's some poor assumptions that we make when we use the language Bible translation.
Yeah. The goal of Bible translation, as all translation, is to replicate as accurately as possible the original meaning of the text, what the author intended
Okay.
in good, clear, and contemporary English. That's what I would say. The
Okay.
goal of translation is not to replicate the form of the text.
Hmm.
And this is why, this is the greatest misunderstanding with reference to Bible translation, is that a literal translation is the goal,
Yeah.
because that's more accurate. Well, in fact, if you look at the way translation is done worldwide, languages differ significantly in terms of word meanings, in terms
Yeah.
of idioms, in terms of collocations, in a whole range of ways, so that to replicate a language word for word generally is a very poor translation.
Okay.
And so we're not looking for literal accuracy, as some would call it, which is an
Sure.
oxymoron. We're looking for replicate the meaning as accurately as possible. The goal is always meaning, not form. Now, if the form, always carries meaning, and if the form is necessary to replicate some of that meaning, then you would try to replicate the form as well. But the ultimate goal is always meaning, not form.
Okay. That would be one that I feel like there's a big gap between translators and the general Christian in terms of what they think the goal is there.
Yeah, and when this was all blowing up back then, Zondervan kind of took me on the road to do some lectures.
Okay.
It's amazing how simple it was to convince people of the truth. Because anyone who's ever learned or taken a second language as a course very quickly recognizes, and the example I would always use, I live in San Diego, so Spanish is widely spoken. I just say, ¿Cómo se llama? What does that phrase mean? And immediately anyone who said Spanish says that means what's your name? And I say, oh no, that doesn't mean what's your name. It's how yourself call. It's how yourself call. And you're changing the grammatical forms, but you reproduce the meaning. And so to translate it literally is not only inaccurate, it's inaccurate, it's just a bad translation. And I would say that, if a speech is given at the United Nations and it's being translated into 100 different, simultaneously translated into 100 different languages, not a single one of those translators is translating literally, because if they were, they'd be fired on the spot for being such a poor translator.
Yeah.
And then we turn to Bible translation and we say, oh no, the literal meaning of this is, and then we give a terrible translation of it. And so I tell my students to just banish that word literal, because it's just wrong. It's not what you think it means, basically.
I imagine knowing that it's easy or easier for people like you to identify bad translations where they've set out with that goal instead.
Oh, yeah. Well, certainly, yeah. And you go back to a version like Young's literal translation, and it's just a comical almost, the way it reads, and it's a crib on the original language, which can be a helpful tool. I mean, if you're a first-year Greek student, you love the literal versions. I used to hide our NASBs underneath our Greek Bibles if we hadn't done our Greek homework, because then you could just kind of read the NASB and you're getting somewhere near what is a word-for-word translation. And so, but that's not the way people speak. And it's amazing how much what we jokingly call Biblish, or Greeklish, is still in our translations, because we translations tend to be done by scholars who are looking at the Greek when they should be thinking in English instead.
I'm sure I confused a lot of people through the years as I tried my best to keep preaching out of the NASB. When, coming fresh out of seminary, I was like, this is the one I got to study. This is where I got to, but it's not always so readable.
Right. Yeah. And it's a good translation. As I say, all these translations are good translations. And it was our translation in Southern California. It really became a dominant translation in many ways. When the King James was being replaced is the wrong word, but you know what I mean.
Well, even for yourself, were there some big realizations about Bible translation that you came upon when you became a Bible translator? Like I didn't like some little revelations, whether it be even about methods, goals, difficulties, variables.
Well, I've been learning. I learn every day. So I mean, absolutely. There's new revelations all the time. And it's amazing. Language is fascinating. It's hilarious at times, but it's fascinating how it works. I mean, it shouldn't work in many ways, because there's so many exceptions to the rule. I often start off lectures with a little bit called crazy English. by a guy named Richard Lederer, who
Okay.
was had a podcast, or not a podcast, a radio program called Away with Words for years on PBS, and he would just play with the English language and show how absurdly ridiculous it is, how words that are the same word can mean opposite meanings. And so I'd start off reading a little bit from that. And yet God has chosen language as the means by which to communicate
Yeah.
his self-revelation. And it works beautifully, but it works in surprising ways. And so I'm always surprised to see how language functions.
Any cautionary words to pastors, that maybe have developed in you as you've done more Bible translation or just more language?
Yeah,
Like
yeah, no, I think comparing translations,
okay,
recognizing, I mean, really, to use more, what I say is, which translation is best? Well, use more than one, really. That's the
yeah,
key, because you're going to see a different perspective on the text, and also use them from across the translation spectrum. Which, what I mean by that is use one of the more literal versions, use one highly idiomatic version,
yeah,
like the New Living Translation, let's say, or the New Century Version. And then I would say your standard Bible should probably be something from the middle range, which would be NIV or CSB or the NET, the New English Translation, something like that would be your best, because it's a wonderful balance between sort of capturing those formal features of the language that are important and it communicating it in good, clear, contemporary
yeah.
English.
How dangerous do you think a little bit of language is?
You've probably heard that. Yeah. A little Greek is a dangerous thing.
Yeah.
Well, and
Well,
I don't.
I wonder often what scholars like yourself are thinking as a lot of us get up and do, real quick word studies.
Yeah.
Like
Yeah.
this word literally means,
Yeah. Hopefully not being too cynical. When I hear a pastor say, now the Greek word for this is, I tell
yeah,
my students to close their ears, because probably 80% of the time what they're going to say next is wrong.
sure.
Yeah. We mentioned Carson. Carson wrote a book called Exegetical Fallacies. And
Yeah.
in the book,
That was huge
he
for me.
gives a lot of examples of the etymological fallacy, where
Yeah.
you take a word and break it into its component parts and say that's what it means.
Yep.
The church means the called out ones, for example. Well, actually, see, it doesn't mean the called out ones. It means an assembly or gathering of people. And we make that mistake, those lexical mistakes,
Yeah.
frequently when we try to play with the Greek. So
Do you think one of the problems is that we often go to the meaning the lexicon rather than looking contextually or even how it's used throughout the text?
no, I would say the lexicon is a great place to start. Just
Okay.
recognize that a lexicon is a dictionary. It's giving the various possible meanings, but
Okay.
it's the context that determines that meaning, as you
So
just said.
start there and move into
Yeah,
the
yeah. What
text.
can the word mean? And then what does the word mean in context? That's how you
Okay.
do a word study, not by taking the word and breaking it down into its component parts.
Okay.
Because we know that understand in English doesn't mean to stand under, and we would never do this in English. It's absurd when we do it in English, and yet we do it in Greek freely without,
Sure.
assuming that breaking a word down is going to give us its meaning. And it simply doesn't. It can, sometimes it does, but many times it doesn't. So.
Do you think we assume too much sometimes when we go, when we find a word in Philippians and then we base its meaning on how Paul used the same word in another letter? Is that maybe not quite as, one for one as we make
Right.
it,
Well,
or do you think
it's
that's
not one for one, but I think that's what you do want to pay attention to, things like that. I mean,
okay?
you want to know how Paul uses a word. That's important.
Okay.
But you can't assume that because Paul used the word one way in one context, he used it the same way in another
Okay.
context. Because we constantly use the same word. We'd use the same word in two different sentences, one followed by the other, and never give it a second thought that the word is meaning something entirely different in the second one.
Yeah.
It's just the way we speak. And so to assume that Paul is somehow tied to a single sense of a lexical item, and always is going to mean the same thing, it's just not the case. I mean, the classic example of the most difficult word in Paul to translate is the Greek word sarx,
Okay.
which traditionally has been translated flesh, which in English doesn't help very much, because flesh is in English is either body tissue or it's a color.
Yeah.
And in Greek, the word has a whole range of possible meanings. And Paul uses it as a technical theological term to mean really the old age in Adam, sometimes translated sinful nature, sometimes translated realm of sinful existence or something like that. that isn't an easy word to translate. And
Okay.
so, but Paul could use the word in one sentence to mean that sinful nature, and the very next sentence to mean a human being. And he does. And so you have to pay careful attention to the context to determine
Okay.
which sense within the range of potential meanings that word has is intended then.
Okay. Yeah, that's a guy. I've never thought of sarx as the most difficult. That's a good point. I mean, just because it's so general and almost simple that hard to lock down
Right.
the
And the
true meaning.
danger is that if you translate it as flesh, it can often sound like you're contrasting the material world for the immaterial world.
Yeah.
And flesh and spirit, that idea, almost a Platonic sense. And so, and sinful nature is a problem because Paul doesn't really seem to be saying every human being has two natures battling within them.
Yeah.
It's not about natures. And so, yeah, we actually have gone back to flesh
Okay.
on some occasions because just recognizing that there is no good English translation. And so we're going to make people learn the technical term by using the older terminology. So that's the 2011 NIV, in some ways, has come back a bit
Yeah.
on that, translating it more formally because there isn't a good English word
Okay.
to
Could you
translate
say
it.
the same thing about a word like cosmos? Maybe, I mean, like God
It,
love the world, but then John being like, don't love the world,
yeah,
just
yeah,
so
that's
general
a
that it's
great,
hard to.
yeah, that's a great example of that as well. Does God love the world, or is the world, the evil world system that will be destroyed? Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I wonder in your years of Bible translation, could you, I'm sure there's again been a ton, but what have been some highlights, some exciting moments through your time working in translation? Maybe there's been some breakthroughs that have
Well,
stood out.
working on the NIV committee has just been just a real privilege
Okay.
because it's an extraordinary body of scholars. There's 15 members of the NIV committee, about half Old Testament, about half New Testament. And we meet once a year, every year for a week. And people have made proposals, scholars have made proposals, pastors make proposals, denominations make proposals. They send them in, and we get them ahead of time. We study them, we evaluate them. Many of the members make proposals as well. They bring their
Okay.
proposals, the 15, and we discuss them and then vote on whether to make the change to the NIV to make it more accurate, more readable. I mean, those are
Yeah.
really the keys. The changes we make are related to, is there a better way to translate this that more accurately reflects the meaning of the text? Sometimes there's biblical scholarship that enters into a change in the possible meaning of a Greek or Hebrew word, and so or else just clarity that the way we've translated doesn't communicate well the meaning that we intended
Okay.
for it. And so we vote on that. It takes a super majority of 70% to pass. So the slogan is kind of, if it's not broke, don't fix it.
Okay.
And so most proposals, I would say, fail. The ones that do get passed then will be implemented in the next edition. We don't change the
Okay.
NIV every year.
Okay.
2011 is the last change, is the last revision, and there'll be another revision sometime in the future. It's
Is there any
biblical.
kind of consistent pattern, like every decade or?
They're talking now really in terms of generations.
Okay.
And so rather than decades, generations. So you can decide how far a generation is,
Sure.
but I would guess probably about 20 years or so is what
Okay.
most people would think of. You don't want to change it because people don't want their Bible changing every year, obviously.
Yeah. Yeah.
And yet there is a necessity to change it because words change their meanings. I mean, if
Okay.
the King James Version spoke about a man in gay apparel, gay clothing. Well, that word gay is going to mean something different today than it meant in 1600 when
Sure.
that translation was made. And so there's great examples of the changing changes in meaning. We have a couple of them that my colleague Janine Brown, who's on the committee, the NIV committee, I love to share when we do these sessions together. The NIV, the 1984 NIV said in Chronicles, it said that they were about to attack a city because there was much booty there. there was much booty in the city, and of course, and they meant there was much plunder,
Sure. Yeah.
but in fact, booty has a very different meaning today than it
Yeah.
did in that context. The other one that we changed in 2011 was thongs, the word thongs,
Yeah.
which Delilah tied up Samson with a thong. Well, that obviously means something different today than
Yeah.
it did back
Sure.
then,
Yeah.
and so I think we translate that as bow strap because that
Yeah.
a thong in terms of a strap. So, those are some of the funny changes that
Yeah.
you realize, and it's funny when that one is proposed. About half the committee started laughing. The other half said,
Okay.
what? And you realize
Yeah.
these committees are generally made up of old white men, and so,
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
who may or may not be in touch with contemporary language. So you have to
Sure.
think, okay, how's the majority of the Christian public or the majority
Yeah.
of the reading public going to hear this word?
Yeah.
Obviously, if you're attacking a town because there's booty there, many people today will hear that different.
Yeah. So the committee really does have to be open to hearing, the voices from the public to,
Absolutely, absolutely. Yeah.
well, I wonder if you could give people some insight because I feel like maybe this is one of the things that leads to bad assumptions sometimes. What 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 does the process look like for Bible translation? Like what did it look like to develop the NIV? Like one scholar sitting alone in his room, 15 men all together, like wrestling. What exactly, maybe it's too complicated to really dive into, but what does that process look like
Yeah,
to
and it varies certainly from translation to translation. Can
okay,
give you sort of the NIV
okay.
history, and there is actually a chapter, a question on the NIV history in the book
Yeah.
if people are
Yeah, so
interested.
in that you don't have to exhaust, but maybe enough to
Yeah,
point
oh,
people to the book
absolutely,
or
yeah.
yeah.
Well, most translations are either individual translations or committee translations.
Okay.
And you've got classic individual translations. The Living Translation by Kenneth Taylor. I'm sorry, the Living Bible
Okay.
by Kenneth Taylor was a huge success in the 1960s. And Kenneth Taylor had been taking the American Standard Version, a very literal version, and paraphrasing it for his children in devotions. And it was very successful in that context. He decided to publish it. First of all, as living letters of Paul, and then eventually the full New Testament, then the full Bible.
Okay.
And it caught on. It was huge because for the first time, people read the Bible and they said, "This is English. I actually understand this. This is clear." And so that was an individual translation. Eugene Peterson's The Message is an individual translation done primarily by one person.
Yeah.
The value of an individual translation is you get that person's these people tend to be incredibly gifted in the English
I was
language.
gonna say we're really hard on the individual translation sometimes, but surely the people, at least the majority of the time, putting these out have are just brilliant
Yep.
on another
Yeah.
level that they could even produce such a thing.
Right. And we're hard on them. We don't like them. But
Yeah.
then the reason we don't like them is because they're so popular.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah.
Everyone loves them because they're so relevant. Even though they engage you, and they sound so relevant and
Yeah.
appropriate, and and even though they may suffer in terms of accuracy in some ways. And there's the challenge is when you have a committee together, you get lots of diverse scholarship. You got people challenging, well, that's not quite what it means. We need to, pursue this
Yeah.
part of the meaning. And in fact, both of those men, Peterson and Taylor, for their larger Bibles, they did do a lot of consulting with others. They
Okay.
had a lot of input from scholars and so
Okay.
forth. And then the New Living Translation, interestingly enough, is a revision of the Living Bible, but done by a committee, done by
Okay.
scholars. So that's why people say it's definitely not a paraphrase.
Okay.
Um, and that word is probably a
I was gonna
misunderstood
say, do we
word.
misuse that word when we
Oh
attach
my
it a lot
goodness,
of
yeah.
times?
Because really, paraphrase, the word in linguistics, paraphrase usually means not a translation from one language to another, but a simplification. A paraphrase is when you take a statement in your language and simplify it and clarify it to make it clear. Sometimes to
Yeah.
children or sometimes to people with that don't have great reading skills. And so a paraphrase is a restatement in your own language, really. And so really that's what the Living Bible was, because Taylor took the American Standard Version, an English translation, and he paraphrased it for his children.
Yeah.
He restated it in his own words that were much, much clearer. So that was a true paraphrase. And it said on the front,
Yeah.
a paraphrase. But for many people, paraphrase means just loose and inaccurate, right?
Yeah.
In other words, that you kind of don't pay much attention to the really important stuff, details. But in fact, if a loose and an inaccurate translation is just a bad translation, it's not necessarily
Sure.
paraphrase.
Yeah.
So
And so, I mean, people always that don't like the message are always like, well, that's a paraphrase.
right.
But technically, Peterson translated.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. It's not a paraphrase.
Okay.
He took it from the Greek and English. I would call it, in some ways, it's a transculturation
Okay.
rather than a translation. Now, much of it is a translation, so I want to give him credit there, but it's a transculturation in that the goal of a translation is normally to take the reader and take them back into the world of the text.
Okay.
So you're hearing it as it was heard in that context. Peterson often does that, but he also often takes the reader or takes the original message and brings it into our context.
Okay.
And so you lose something culturally, but you gain something in terms of relevance.
Yeah.
So for example, and this is not from Peterson, I'm just making this up to make the point clear, where Jesus says they make their phylacteries broad. And the phylacteries are those little boxes with verses inside that the Jews would wear on their forehead or on their arm. And Jesus said they make a show of their religion by making them really, really broad. Well, Peterson might say something like they bring really big Bibles to church so that people can notice them.
Yeah.
Well, culturally, that's not what it meant. But in fact, that communicates in a relevant way today what was intended in that cultural context. So you lose cultural accuracy to gain cultural relevance.
Sure. I think like the one example you pointed out in the book where Peterson says, and God moved into the neighborhood.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Which
That's
obviously no neighborhood word there, but conveys the sense of the
right. Exactly. And it's so relevant and appropriate in our context where neighborhoods are such significant cultural
I mean, it's a powerful statement when I read it in the message, like, oh, God moved into the, like that just, it hits different or it understand it differently than reading the NASB version of that.
So I would say, as many others have, that it's a great tool. Use it in your preaching. It's going to help you be more relevant.
Yeah.
But always use it beside a true translation.
Sure.
And when we're going earlier with the New Living Translation, the NLT is a translation. It's meant to replicate the meaning of the text in contemporary English. That's a translation. It's not a paraphrase. Paraphrase, when used correctly, means a restatement in your own language.
Okay.
And when used incorrectly, means a loose and inaccurate translation. Well, any translation can be loose and inaccurate, whether it's literal or idiomatic. So that's just a bad translation. That's not a paraphrase.
That's a good clarification for everyone. Well, the book, again, it's been out for about a year already, right? So it's easy to get a hold of. But 40 questions about Bible translation. I was curious why this book at the time you wrote it. Like, did it come out of an increasing sense of, a gap between Bible translators and the public? Was there a frustration of more and more assumptions that were incorrect, or?
Well, that's a given because that's consistent and it's always been the case.
Okay.
So that's why I always take the opportunity when given to speak about Bible translation, because there are such misinformation. I wrote a book with Gordon Fee about, almost 20 years ago now, called How to Choose a Translation for All It's Worth.
Yeah.
And that was sort of meant to respond to the literal is accurate, and had thought about maybe finding a way to update that. And I might still revise it. Gordon is no longer with us, but then someone said, oh, you should do one in the 40 questions series.
Okay.
And so when I saw the series, I thought this will give me a chance to do something that we didn't do in How to Choose a Translation. And that is cover a much broader field. I don't know any book actually that covers everything about translation. From a book is normally about the philosophy of translation. Is it literal? Is it idiomatic? What makes a translation good? Or a survey of translations. What's the NIV? What's the ESV? This kind of thing. And then you've also got books on the history of translation and so forth. Well, by doing the 40 questions, I was able to sort of do short little snippets on all of those areas.
Okay.
From the philosophy of translation, the challenge of individual kinds of translation, idioms, word meanings, all those different things, cultural issues in translation. There's even a final section on international Bible translation. It's by
Okay.
no means a book on international Bible translation,
Sure.
not my area of expertise, so I've learned enormously from international Bible translators. But I felt like I wanted to, that's such an important component of the field. I
Yeah.
wanted to at least introduce scholars to that, or readers to that.
Okay.
And so, that was a great section for me to research because I'm not an expert there, and then to write. So sort of a one-stop shopping on the whole area field of translation,
Yeah.
from translation theory to the history to the KJV to the modern translations to international Bible translation. That was really appealing to me
Okay.
because I'm a sort of a big picture person
Okay.
in my teaching, and also like you, trying to bridge that gap because there is can be such a huge gap between Christian understanding of the Bible and what scholars are saying about the Bible.
Yeah. Well, one, I thought the part on international translations was important because we really do, or at least I find I always think Bible translation, I think English.
Mhm.
Like all my questions are about English Bibles. I don't give too much thought to, Wycliffe's work in international translations and all the work going on there. And then two, I thought the book was brilliant in that it went a lot deeper than I expected it to, but still remained really accessible to,
Uh,
people that have an interest or questions in my congregation. I know that I could hand them this book, but it felt like you went a lot deeper than just, I don't know, it could be 100 questions on Bible translation and really simple, quick answers where it felt like, for me at least, you got into like some really nitty gritty stuff that was absolutely new to me and hugely informational. So I've really appreciated this. I think it is serve a big purpose in the church. I wonder though, and you cover this in the book, but maybe just some questions kind of from the book. What would be some of the greatest? Obviously, there's the gender one. What would be some of the greatest debates among Bible translators these days? What are those? What are the conversations that are still going on that aren't settled, or maybe one or a few? Or
yeah. Well, one issue that I bring it up are there? I have a chapter on, are there issues beyond the formal versus functional? As in the popular Christian world and even in the scholarly world, there isn't a lot of translation scholarship in biblical studies.
yeah,
And there needs to be much more. I think the international Bible translators have had to do that, have gone from the perspective of linguistics and so forth. But there isn't enough engagement in translation theory. And I would even say, myself, who I have dabbled,
yeah,
I haven't done enough. Um, and so one of the big issues in translation theory, um, introduced really by a guy named Lawrence Venuti, is the domestication versus foreignizing of translation. And he shocked everyone in some ways by challenging the idea that a translation should be readable.
yeah,
And sort of said, no, a translation should reflect the culture of the language it's translated in. And that sounds like an argument for literal translation, but then he said the reason is because when you domesticate a language, you use it as power to control people. So he
yeah.
was arguing against
Hmm.
Eugene Nida and the Wycliffe translators and other groups who would go into a culture and translate the Bible clearly,
Yeah,
um, in order to win converts, you see, and from his perspective, that's colonization, basically, that's domination, that's suppressing of native cultures.
yeah,
And so you're using language, making it sound familiar so that they'll accept it, so that then they become Christians, and then you've destroyed that culture. And so that idea of language as a dominating, as a power tool, it already was in the field, but
yeah,
Venuti's sort of work has done a lot to to develop it, and many have, so how is translation used then? Is it used as a tool to control, or is it used? And so Venuti would say you should keep it sounding foreign,
Okay.
so that
Oh,
native
yeah,
peoples
interesting.
recognize this is an alien concept that may go against their own.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, that's really interesting. So are there books, articles about that
Oh
coming out?
yes, yeah,
Okay.
yeah, yeah. You'll find in the secular literature, you'll see quite a lot there, and language, also indictments or critiques of biblical stuff,
Okay.
from what we might call the left, can sometimes deal with that as well.
Okay.
Um,
Oh, that's very interesting. I'm sure to be in the room with you guys, and even between the conversations between different committees would be fascinating, and things that the average Bible reader has no idea that these kind of conversations are happening, but important ones.
right, yeah, and I have to say, we don't talk about translation theory. I mean,
Okay.
we don't talk about those kinds of theory
Okay.
issues very much. The issue of, literal versus idiomatic still, I think, remains um, the biggest challenge we face,
Okay.
because we still, as biblical scholars, we still say, but the Greek says, and then we'll say something in English, but the Greek says brothers. Well, that's just wrong.
Yeah.
Brothers is an English word. The Greek says adelphoi. Now, what does the Greek mean, in that context?
Yeah.
And so that those are still, I think, in terms of, and this is why I say that biblical scholarship has not done enough in the broader field of linguistics. But I think we still talk mostly about these basic issues of
Okay.
form versus function, and how to best communicate the meaning of the text.
Okay.
Assuming that the goal is to communicate clearly in contemporary English what the text actually meant.
Yeah. Can I ask this though? Just because I think some people, it's easy when you have differing opinions to kind of pit scholars against one another. Maybe this is too invasive of a question, but do you enjoy good camaraderie,
Mm.
fellowship within the Bible translation committees with other scholars who even see some of the intricacies of the NIV versus other, or whatever it might be, differently
Sure,
than you?
sure. Oh yeah, yeah. And I think scholarship should always be cordial.
Yeah.
Just like politics should be cordial,
Yeah.
even though it isn't oftentimes. And so I think these issues need to be debated, and
Yep.
every argument is fair game. Um, so I do think we should be engaging. We should be asking the question. I mean, there are times when we might go too far in the way we translate something, and
And you need
care
some
too
pushback.
much. Yeah, it needs
Yep.
some pushback. So I have to say the committee is just a fascinating place in that regard,
Okay.
because like you've got such enormous intellects. I mean, people just I have incredible respect for, and just feel like a very small in comparison to their scholarship. And they'll bring a proposal, and maybe it'll get voted down. And to see the
Okay.
humility
Yeah.
has been really a powerful thing for me, to see them say, okay, well, let's move on to the next one. Um,
That would be the important thing, I feel like, for us to see more or recognize, even here like this, that there is a lot of humility on these committees.
Yeah, there needs to be, and
Yeah.
I can just talk about the chemistry in the NIV committee. I mean, for most all of us, this is a highlight of the year, to be
Okay.
together with these men and women, and their scholarship is all inspiring in many ways.
Yeah.
I actually dedicated the book to the committee. I don't know if you saw the dedication.
Okay.
It says, to my colleagues on the Committee on Bible Translation for the New International Version, whose brilliance in all things biblical, humility, wit, and wisdom are a constant source of joy and inspiration.
That's great.
So that really says it all in
Yeah.
terms of what I've taken from the committee and the respect I have for these individuals.
Okay. Oh, that's awesome. Is Tremper Lundman, is he on the NIV?
So Tremper is a very close friend, though, and he's on
Okay.
the NLT committee. And so
Oh, okay.
we crossed, we discussed this quite a lot. He's very
Okay.
much in line.
Okay.
And he wrote a wonderful endorsement for me here.
Yeah, I
But
saw that.
Trevor and I have been on a number of projects together, and
Oh, neat.
he's a dear friend. and a brilliant scholar and incredibly prolific.
Yeah. I chatted with him not too long ago, a few months ago, maybe. And I remember him talking about some Bible translation committee that he was on. But that was what did you say? That one was not NIV, but
He's on the NLT,
NLT.
New Living
Okay.
Translation.
Yeah.
Plus, Trimper and I, together with Dan Taylor from Bethel College, did the revision of the New Century Version.
Oh, okay.
So we farmed it out to scholars who made suggestions and comments for a
Okay.
revision. Um, and then we together did a Bible called the Expanded Bible,
Okay.
which was meant to be something like a replacement for the Amplified Bible,
Okay.
which it isn't now. It hasn't
Okay.
really. Um, Thomas Nelson, who produced it, didn't really decide it was the kind of thing they wanted to push a lot of marketing
Okay.
dollars behind. So we
Okay.
spent a lot of time on that. The
Okay.
Expanded Bible. Tremper, me, and Dan Taylor were the executive editors
Okay.
for it. So we've done a lot of work together on translation, both on the New Century Version and in the Expanded Bible.
Okay.
But we are on two different committees of two of the
Okay.
major English translations. Yeah.
This is a personal question, but have you come across Dr. Larry Perkins ever? Larry's my he's my supervisor for my thesis currently, and he's done a lot of work. He does a lot of work in Bible translation, but in Septuagint
Oh,
studies right
excellent.
now. But I
Yeah.
don't know how much. He's at Trinity Western University
I
in
knew his
Cambridge.
name. When you said his name, I was just grasping to see how I knew him. But he's at
Okay,
Trinity.
Trinity Western.
Yeah,
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 I,
yeah,
I
yeah.
work mostly with Dr. Perkins and then Brian Rapsky, who
Oh,
is most known for his work in Paul's imprisonments
sure, of course. I was with Brian in Aberdeen.
oh, neat.
Yeah, so Brian's a good friend. Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, that's
His
really neat.
his
Okay,
work is excellent.
I've TA'd and RA'd for Brian for or did for a lot of years, and
Right.
oh,
I
that's
love
very
Brian.
neat.
Brian's a great guy. Yeah, he was a good friend in Aberdeen when we were together with our
Okay,
families. Yeah.
his mind always just blows me away of the
Yeah.
things he can recall and whatnot. But a good man. Can I ask you this? I don't want to keep you too much longer, but try and get through a few more questions that I have. To some degree, is every translation have a level of personal opinion in it? I mean, obviously, a committee can help. I don't know, make it a bit wider, but
Sure.
are there points then in some modern translations where the influence of the committee on the text can go too far, where it
Sure.
becomes a sort of personal commentary from
Sure.
those scholars?
Sure. And the goal is, we're always going to run short of our goal, and there is no
Sure.
such thing as a perfect translation. Excuse me. Every translation is going to, well, language itself makes a perfect translation impossible because language itself has a measure of imprecision and ambiguity to it, and it always will.
Okay.
So, that discounts a perfect translation. Some people want to do a literal one because they want to be as close as possible. But of course, by being close in form, as we said, you're moving away potentially in terms of function or meaning. So yes, I think that's part of humility is recognizing
Okay.
that. It's interesting. The King James Version originally came with like a 30-page preface, maybe
Interesting.
even longer than that. It's
Okay.
available. You can find it, but it's not printed unfortunately. And in that, you see a great deal of humility by the translators. They basically say this version is one link in a long chain of translation. There's been many that have come before us. Many will follow. It's not a perfect translation, but we hope it will be a positive contributor. And very interesting to see the King James Version translators themselves, acknowledging the imperfection of their own work,
Okay.
and that it is the Word of God, even though imperfect presentation of the Word of God. And so the KJV only people really need to read their preface, the
Yeah.
original preface,
Yeah.
their translation.
Oh, I really appreciate the KGB stuff that you wrote in the book because I mean that's congregationally that seems to always be one of the most pressing questions, at least for a certain generation
Sure,
and
sure.
and up. And yeah, I haven't read, haven't come across too many books. Maybe there are a lot that really address that, but you gave me thorough answers
Oh,
in the
good.
book, so I appreciated that. Can I just fire off a few translations for you, and you just give a few word answer of I don't know what you what your opinion of is of them,
Sure.
or the good and the bad or whatever. ESV. a good
Yeah,
Bible?
ESV is a fine translation.
Okay.
You'll find an article I wrote called "Why the English Standard Version Should Not Become the Standard English Version."
Okay. A
And
popular article or journal article?
it wasn't published, but it's available on my website.
Okay.
And
I'll
it's
look there.
available if you type it, if you go to the ESV Wikipedia page, it's actually available, I think, through
Okay.
that.
Okay.
But yeah, it's a critique, and it came at the point when people were saying, "Oh, this is the best thing ever. It's
Okay.
great for children. It's great for." Well, it's 5% change from the RSV, which I would
Okay.
say is a great translation, but is overly literal. Doesn't take into account the nature of idioms or collocations or other things. It's just there's problems with the ESV, and yet
Okay.
when it came out, it was meant to be the remedy to everything,
Okay.
basically. And so the article is a bit tongue in cheek. There's some humor at the beginning of it, in particular, where I give a number of oops translations where they sort of slipped. Yeah, I won't go
Okay.
into this,
Sure.
but yeah,
Yeah, no, that's fine.
but
The
yeah, no. So
Passion.
it's an
Oh,
excellent
sorry. Go.
translation, but
Yeah.
it's gotten more press and more endorsements than it probably deserved in terms of being in
Okay.
terms of value. Yeah.
Yeah, it's not the end all be all of
No.
translations, even though
It's a
it's a
good
good.
update. It's a good
Yeah.
evangelical update because they got rid of all the controversial passages.
Okay.
Good evangelical update of the RSV,
Okay.
basically. Yeah.
The Passion translation.
Yeah, I'd actually avoid the Passion. I've actually
Okay.
had Brian Simmons, is that his name? Um, I don't want to misrepresent his name, but he contacted me actually, and he actually uses Gordon's in my book on his website to defend his translation
Oh,
philosophy,
interesting. Okay.
which is interesting. And yet there are real, and I challenged him on a number of these. There's real flaws with the Passion Translation.
Okay.
He'll say things like, according to the original Aramaic, and has no basis in the Aramaic. And
Okay.
he admits when I talk to him, he doesn't know Aramaic. He's drawing
Okay.
these from a website. So I
Okay.
would, he also has made, and he's been probably most attacked for making challenges about, new revelation and so forth
Okay.
coming out. So that's a bit dangerous. But I think for me, the translation itself is problematic because he's making claims, particularly in the
Okay.
footnotes, about the Aramaic original that just simply are not reliable.
I haven't looked at it too much. Is the Passion, does he make it, is it a one-man translation?
It is, but it's quite formal. I mean, it's not highly idiomatic. It's not like a Peterson or something
Okay.
like that. As you read it, you wouldn't be terribly shocked or surprised, except for occasionally the idiosyncratic ones that then he says have some kind of basis in the Aramaic. Those are, I would say watch out for those. But I would steer clear of the Passion if I
Okay.
were you.
And the NIV, I mean, what makes you, I mean, it's not a sales pitch, but I'm
Sure,
sure you take pride in the work being done
sure.
by this committee that you're a part of. What makes you
Yeah.
excited about the NIV and
Yeah.
wanting to recommend it to people?
Yeah, and the NIV came out at a time when there was nothing like it really, which is
Okay.
shocking in many ways. There were some really idiomatic translations like the Living Bible,
Okay.
and there were a lot of really formal translations like the KJV, of course, the RSV, and so forth. But there was nothing that really captured that middle ground where the translator says, our goal is contemporary English, but we want to do it, we only depart from the formal when it's going to accomplish that goal.
Okay.
That's one thing that made it successful is it found a middle ground that really there wasn't much translation work in the middle ground. The other thing is it was an extraordinary coalition of evangelicals, and evangelicals buy more Bibles than anyone because they have more
Yeah.
respect
Sure.
for the Bible. And even, you use that word evangelical, sorry, and I know today politically it has all different connotations. But really, it means back then it meant sort of the more intellectual side of conservative Christianity.
Yeah.
And so it received incredible endorsements from a whole range of denominations, even evangelical denominations, a whole range of seminaries contributed to it. More than 100 scholars produced it. So when it came out, it already had a lot of endorsement behind it. And then people picked it up and they could actually understand it. So they had an aha moment, something like the Living Bible. But then scholars are saying, and it's also based on the Greek and Hebrew, and it's very accurate and all of, and so it captured that middle ground. It's the only Bible to have passed up the King James Version in sales
Oh,
still
okay.
today, year
Okay.
by year. the NIV sells more than the King James, and it's the only Bible still. KJV is still second now to the NIV in that. And that at one point it held almost 35-40% of the Bible market, which is just
Oh, wow.
huge. Now it's much lower than that because there's so many competitors. There's so many other versions in the middle area.
Yeah.
I mentioned the Christian Standard Bible. There's the Common English Bible, CEB. There's the Net Bible. There's the New American Bible, Roman Catholic Version. Those are all clamoring for that middle position,
Yeah.
saying we're accurate and readable as well. So you probably never have the same kind of unanimity around a translation like was around the King James, like we could all say was around the NIV or very close to it in the 1970s, 1980s. So that's more than you wanted, but yeah.
No, that's great. I appreciate it. So, I mean, just kind of ending here again, what is the right Bible for people? I think you make the quote, and I'll probably misquote you, but the right Bible or the perfect Bible is the one you read.
That's
Something
perfect.
to that effect.
That's perfect. I could not say it, any better than that. Yeah, I mean, all these Bibles can communicate God's word and God's plan of salvation,
Okay.
the story of God's creation of the world, humanity's fall, and God's purpose and plan to restore all of creation back to himself. And they, I would say, okay, avoid the Jehovah's Witnesses Bible,
Yeah.
the New World Translation, avoid versions like the Passion that don't really have scholarship behind them.
Yeah.
But in general, all the major Bibles you're going to find in any Christian bookstore are going to lead you to the truth. And so read, use the Bible that you enjoy, that you will read.
Yeah. Amen. Well, Dr. Strauss, thank you so much for your time. Thank you for your work on these committees in translating. I appreciate getting to meet you because I get to put yet another face of someone who I hugely respect and can sense just the humility and godliness, and to know that you're one of the men working on the Bibles we're reading. That's meaningful to me. And thank you for the book. I will continue to pass this out to people because, again, I think you've done a huge service to us in the church.
Well, you've been very encouraging to me, Ryley, and I really appreciate it. This is exactly the kind of conversations we need to be having in the Christian world. And so I really appreciate your encouragement and your words of just excellence. So
thank you. I appreciate it.